Siberia presents itself as a realm steeped in myth. Its severe winters and expansive, desolate terrains have led many to liken it to the mystical allure associated with the North Pole. However, unlike the North Pole, Siberia is indeed a region within Russia, a fact that has contributed to Russia acquiring a similar reputation among certain foreigners. Nevertheless, Siberia has not always been affiliated with any single nation. Given its geographical location as part of the Asian continent, it can be somewhat perplexing why it is now commonly perceived by many as European. Thus, how did Siberia integrate into Russia's domain anyway? The initial documented reference to Siberia in Russian literature dates back to 1407, recounting the story of a Tatar named Khan Toktamish who was assassinated in the Siberian territories. Moreover, earlier Novgorod chronicles document expeditions into a region referred to as Ugria, believed to be an early designation for Siberia. Following the conquest of Novgorod by the Grand Duke of Moscow, any territories acquired by the Novgorodians in Siberia would consequently fall under Moscow's dominion, despite a significant portion of the region remaining under the control of local Tatar Khans. Certain Tatar Khans opted to pledge allegiance as vassals to the Russian czars, whereas others resisted, leading to a prolonged period of contention regarding the true authority over the Siberian territories. During these early conquests, the Tsardom of Russia encompassed a group known as the Cossacks, an East Slavic Orthodox Christian people originating from the Eastern European steppes. In the late 16th century, certain Cossacks embarked on territorial expansion endeavors, with one individual, Yermak Timofeyevich, demonstrating particular resolve to pursue this goal. Assembling a formidable force of over 500 Cossacks, accompanied by Polish, Lithuanian, and German mercenaries, Timofeyevich led his troops into Siberia, encountering indigenous settlements that were already under the authority of Russia's neighboring ruler, the Khan of Siberia. In 1581, the Cossacks advanced through Siberian territory, gradually asserting their dominance over local towns and inhabitants. The Russians did not simply advance without resistance. Numerous local Tatar groups launched counterattacks and retaliatory raids against the invaders, putting up a courageous defense. However, undeterred, the Cossacks pressed onward, with their next objective being Iskar, the capital of Siberia. Following clashes with the forces of the Siberian Khan Kuksum and his Tatar allies, the Cossacks succeeded in capturing the capital in October of 1582, despite facing ongoing Tatar resistance. Kukum temporarily withdrew into the steppes, but he resurfaced in late summer of 1584 with a dramatic ambush on Timofeyevich's troops. Caught off guard, the Cossacks were completely routed, and tragically, Timofeyevich did not survive the encounter. In the aftermath of this defeat, the remaining troops withdrew from the capital as the Tatars ravaged the entire city. It would be 2 years before the Cossacks, now reinforced with additional military support from the Tsar, could reclaim the capital, or what remained of it. Once again, the locals found themselves outmatched by Russian firearms, allowing the Cossacks to establish more permanent footholds in the region. This included the construction of their fortress at Tyumen, situated not far from the capital city they had recently captured and lost. In the ensuing years, as clashes persisted between the Russians and the locals, Kukum repeatedly eluded capture, even surviving a significant defeat at the Battle of Urmin in 1598. However, during the conflict, members of the Khan's family were captured and taken back to Moscow as hostages. This event had a profound impact on the future trajectory of Kukum's political and military endeavors. Ultimately, Kukum found refuge in the southern reaches of the Siberian region alongside the Nogai horde. From there, he sought to negotiate with the Tsar, requesting permission to obtain land near the Irtysh River. However, his request was promptly denied. In response, the Tsar extended an invitation for the Khan to visit Moscow, ostensibly to comfort himself, but Kukum wisely refrained from taking such bait. Following the Khan's demise at the onset of the 17th century, the Russians persisted in their expansion across Siberia, constructing forts and outposts along the way. Initially, they even attempted to push deeper into Asia. However, upon encountering formidable artillery and military forces at the Chinese border, they concluded that this marked the limit of their expansion. Nevertheless, the Russian borders expanded by millions of square kilometers in just a few decades. By 1640, the entirety of the Siberian territory under Khan's rule and beyond had been incorporated into the Russian Tsardom, forming what would now be collectively referred to as Siberia. While this expansion was undoubtedly remarkable from the Russian standpoint, it was not perceived in quite the same light by the indigenous population of Siberia. The Cossack invasion and subsequent conquest of Siberia had a comparable effect to other conquest or colonization endeavors worldwide: the rapid spread of diseases among the native population. Smallpox, especially, wreaked havoc due to its highly contagious nature and high mortality rate, leading to the belief that it wiped out approximately 80% of certain populations. Alongside the devastation caused by warfare, the impact of these diseases weakened resistance to the invaders swiftly. At first, the Cossacks made some attempts to address resistance through negotiation. However, if the locals refused to submit to the Russian Tsar, the Cossacks would resort to violence. Certain native populations also engaged in warfare, aiming to drive the Russians out of the region. This led to a series of significant rebellions in 1706, 1731, and 1741 by the Itelmens. However, they were repeatedly suppressed by the Russians, largely due to the significant disparity in weaponry favoring the Russians. The resistance from the better-armed Cossacks, starting in 1745 and lasting over a decade, posed a significantly greater challenge for the Cossacks to quell. However, eventually, they managed to suppress the Cossacks. The Chukchi presented perhaps the strongest and most formidable native resistance for the Russians to contend with. Throughout the mid-18th century, they engaged in near-constant battles with the Cossacks and frequently emerged victorious. Although these conflicts typically involved relatively small-scale engagements and thus did not result in significant Russian casualties, the Tsar was nonetheless enraged by the persistent resistance of the Chukchi. In 1742, Empress Elizabeth issued a decree instructing the Cossacks to use armed force against the defiant Chukchi, exterminate them entirely. It wouldn't be long before a combination of disease and warfare definitively quelled native rebellions, solidifying Russia's control over Siberia. However, why did they pursue this conquest in the first place? What motivated their desire for Siberia? Indeed, the primary motive behind Russia's expansion into Siberia was likely driven by one factor: fur. During the early Novgorod expeditions into Siberia, it became evident that the indigenous populations possessed valuable furs that could be traded and sold for considerable profit. This also elucidates why the conquered native vassals were obligated to pay their tribute in furs. This motive significantly bolstered the Russian economy and augmented its revenue accordingly. In essence, the Cossacks recognized that while Siberia was inhabited at the time of their invasion, its population density was not so high that they would be unable to overpower the less well-equipped locals through attrition. And this endeavor would be worthwhile because the Cossacks understood that the natives possessed an abundance of furs that could be appropriated for the benefit of the Russians. Once the Tsar became cognizant of this opportunity, it became even easier for the Cossacks, who now had the backing of the state. The lucrative fur trade and resulting revenue greatly enriched the Tsar himself. The conflict with the Chukchis did not yield such favorable outcomes, and the Cossacks probably did not anticipate encountering such a formidable obstacle until they were directly confronted with it. While they ultimately managed to overcome this challenge and consolidate their rule over Siberia, the disruption caused by the conflict with the Chukchis undoubtedly incurred costs in terms of money, resources, and time. resources that the Russians would have preferred to allocate elsewhere, such as in the fur trade. Indeed, the Cossacks ventured into Siberia with the aim of establishing a profitable fur trade, and they succeeded admirably in this endeavor. Along the way, they significantly expanded Russian territory, seizing control of the region of Siberia, which remains an integral part of Russia to this day. Russia's conquest of Siberia can be attributed in part to the Cossacks' superior weaponry, especially firearms and artillery. Additionally, the relatively small population of Siberia and their lack of preparedness for warfare played a significant role. In contrast, the Russians possessed extensive military experience and had the capability to readily replenish their forces, contributing to their advantage in the conquest of Siberia. The devastation caused by disease among native populations further bolstered the Cossacks' campaigns. Moreover, the presence of only one centralized authority overseeing the fragmented region meant that military resistance could be more effectively managed by the Russians. After the collapse of the Siberian rulership, it became inevitable that the remaining native populations would either be brought under subjugation or face complete eradication.